Netflix produces and airs some binge-worthy shows, even if it does mean turning your brain off for 50 minutes at a time. They may not be the most creative at times, but they're still pretty enjoyable, since sometimes you just need to brainlessly absorb something without thinking about plot holes or the tediousness of 7 series of teenage vampire drama. But occasionally, shows will mention something that actually has some relevance to the real world and evokes some interesting discourse. Now, spoilers ahead for the show known as You on Netflix, but in the 3rd season, woman Natalie Engler goes missing. And by missing, I mean she was axed to death by Love and then buried in the forest by Joe. The extensive news coverage, search parties, and attention drawn to the disappearance of this middle-class white woman dominates the first few episodes of the show. But instead of just becoming another plot device, the problematic connotations of the attitudes towards the missing woman is actually commented on by the character Marianne. She calls it missing white woman syndrome. Though this is referring to a piece of fiction, I do think there is some truth in what Marianne says, even if it might be performative so Netflix can score some diversity points, as it's only mentioned once and then never explored again. I've looked into missing white woman syndrome since, and it's something that some academics have written some quite lengthy essays on because they've found some interesting and sadly unfortunate statistics. Now, before I go into this video, I am just going to issue a trigger warning. The video may include topics that some people might find distressing. Misogyny, racism, and gender-based violence and prejudice are referenced in this video. They're not discussed in graphic detail, but they might make you feel uncomfortable nonetheless. Social scientists and media commentators use the term missing white woman syndrome when referring to the disproportionate media coverage of missing person cases, including young, white, upper to middle class women or girls, compared to the relative lack of attention towards non-white missing people, non-white missing women, lower class women, and missing men or boys. Excluding people of other races, classes, and genders, whom in the US make up nearly half of the amount of people that go missing every year, this coverage from news organisations shows an explicit bias. And McLean goes as far as saying that missing white woman syndrome functions as a type of racial hierarchy in the cultural imagery of the USA in particular. Now, a lot of the sources and studies that I've used in this video do actually focus on American cable networks. A, because they have a lot more news networks than we do, and B, because they seem to sensationalise and dramatise everything for entertainment purposes. Several factors are known to influence a news response when a person goes missing. Jukes argues that women, being young, white, conventionally attractive, and from a respectful home, increases the likeliness that the news will report their disappearance. Even in cases where abduction and murder are immediately expected, which are situations that you would assume would make headlines, the interest of the media will vary depending on the background of the victim. These factors then go on to influence how the missing person is portrayed. Part of missing white woman syndrome is the spectacle that is made of this victim. And the life is usually put on show to portray them as a loving and loyal family member who will be missed, particularly in the cases of middle-class women. Perhaps this is to evoke sympathy in an audience. After all, we are more likely to feel for someone that we care for and that we respect than someone that is portrayed in a less favourable light. To do this, the media will frequently use pictures of missing white women with their husbands and their families and describe their appearances with a particular focus on facial features that show innocence, like smiles and dimples. Again, this is another attempt to humanise the victim and ensure that the audience connects with them instead of just seeing them as another face. This increases the chances that people will get involved with the case and help search for the missing person, and also it ensures that people will keep tuning in either to the shows or buying the papers or browsing the websites that cover these stories, which of course generates revenue. As Douglas McKinnon reveals, it's actually quite possible that cable networks may showcase missing young white attractive women because their research shows that it gets more viewers, which helps them beat the competition and make more money. Because money makes the world go round. As numerous studies conclude, and missing white woman syndrome demonstrates, white people are more likely than non-white people to appear in news stories as victims of crime, even when accounting for how often different racial groups are actually victimized by crime. Basically, the disproportionate overrepresentation of white people and the disproportionate underrepresentation of non-white people therefore can't be explained by actual differences in real-world victimization rates. Though academics have pointed out that the most common crimes against women are often the most invisible and underreported crimes, such as sexual violence or domestic abuse, women and girls are overrepresented as victims. This makes me wonder why. As a female myself, the world does feel pretty dangerous. A, because I'm aware that feminine people like me look like easy targets, so we become easy targets. And B, because of the normalisation of violence and sexual assault against everybody, but especially against women. And having looked at the statistics that have become even more evident since the murder of Sarah Everard in London earlier this year, I don't doubt that women are frequent victims of crime, even if the statistics are actually quite underreported. But it isn't all women that are receiving the limelight. This doesn't mean to undermine the real danger faced by these women, but critiques the obvious bias when it comes to reporting crimes of the same severity. It also implies that these reports aren't made out of care for the women, because if that was the case, all violence against women would get equal amounts of reporting, and this in turn increases hostility towards the news, and is why some people believe that these reports are only made because of ulterior motives. Some hypothesize that cable networks believe that viewers want to see stories about the wealthy when they go missing, because it's believed that abductions happen to underprivileged people on a regular basis. This plays into the dramatisation of the story. We all love a bit of true crime. My favourite is Joshua Miles, and you should go subscribe to them. A crime story is all the more interesting when it's out of the ordinary. We are easily desensitised to statistics, deaths, and violence. As a female, the fact that nearly every woman I know has been assaulted or harassed in some way doesn't actually shock me. It's normalised, and it shouldn't be. Drawing attention to how particular forms of violence are deemed as too ordinary by newsmakers to be considered newsworthy, Carter and Jukes argue that physical and sexual violence committed in the home or by acquaintances and or that is non-fatal tends to fall at the bottom of the hierarchy of crime, and so is left off of the news agenda. And a lot of people tend to argue, well, if women had it that bad, if that much crime actually did happen against women, we would hear about it more. But the reason why the everyday crimes against all women aren't reported isn't because it doesn't happen. It's because it happens so much that it borders on normal, and therefore mundane, and so not entertaining enough. People go missing all the time, but someone from a wealthy family who could have no ties to crime due to their squeaky clean exterior, that isn't normal in the eyes of a news audience. And it isn't normal because they can't find a reason why it was the middle upper class white woman's fault. News media perpetuate a hierarchy of women who are victims, so not all women who experience violence are treated equally. This representation often creates binary categories, which differentiate good from bad women. Whilst good women are seen as innocent and so worth saving or avenging, bad women are positioned as beyond redemption. This is inherently tied to race and class, and it traditionally is the white middle class women who are constructed as innocent and good. What these binaries produce and maintain and uphold are hegemonic assumptions about what are acceptable expressions of femininity. The ideology of this human superiority and inferiority that underlay these binaries encourages the valuing of some lives over others. And that's only within the category of women. Let's not even get started on gender comparison. Exploring how idealized notions of white womanhood has positioned a woman's white body as the epitome of purity, cleanliness, vulnerability, and virginity, Dyer traced this concept back to the Christian traditions of identifying whiteness and blondness with the heavens and angels. I wonder if they also had a thing for blue eyes. He argued that the attention paid to romanticized images of white womanhood implied that the white body is both angelic and forbidden, morally superior and sexually unavailable. Similarly, Wilcox argued that Western thought associates white middle-class women as childlike, with a lack of sexual knowledge and somebody that needs to be guided and looked after. She adds that cultural images of the good and the innocent women are often conflated with passivity, monogamy, and fragility. In America, for example, white middle-class women and girls may actually garner more media coverage because they more readily mirror traditional ideals of American womanhood. And also, a lot of the time, motherhood status may be used to humanize the victim. How many times do you hear things like she's someone's mother, she's someone's daughter, she's someone's wife, she's someone's sister, she's someone's girlfriend? These women are humanized in relation to the lives of the others around them, those that are still around. And this plays into the framing created by the news sources and so influences the likeliness of the news actually being released and also governs the reaction of those receiving it. Framing is a thing that occurs when an issue is repeatedly presented in a way that leaves the recipient of the information the distinct idea of how the issue is supposed to be viewed and reacted to. When the media frame a story, then, it changes the way the audience feels about the story and the people depicted in it. This is what is known as framing effects. It was argued by Mayers in 1997 that poor and or racialized crime victims are often depicted in the news as more blameworthy for their victimization when compared with high-status white women, for example. And so this influences how audiences value the lives of these non-white women and non-wealthy and sometimes non-women in comparison. For example, in sexual assault and sexual homicide cases, if a victim is judged to have deviated from the patriarchal notions of appropriate femininity, such as drinking or using drugs and dressing provocatively or not conservatively enough, which could mean anything depending on who has decided what is conservative and what isn't, or especially if she engages in sex for money, these women are likely to be constructed as at least partially responsible for the violence that has happened against them. And I'd like to point out that although this is far more common for poor and racialized women, this blaming attitude isn't completely avoided by upper class women either, or white women. Just look at some of the comments that were made after the fallout of the Sarah Everard case, a woman who was deceived by a police officer who arrested her and then killed her. Many came out and said that she should have resisted arrest and advised other women to resist arrest. So now we have to resist police. But when people were calling to resist the police in May and June and July of 2020, that's different. Has that got anything to do with who was the victim of the police then? When things hit home, people seem to change their minds on things very quickly. Suddenly people that were defending the police are now saying ACAB. Why? Because you associate yourself with the victim of the crime? Maybe that's why these things are more readily broadcasted. Though this is not as extreme as some of the victim-blaming attitudes received by sex workers or racialised women or poor women. It's not that upper-class white women don't receive any blame, it's just that they're less likely to receive it. As pointed out by Wilcox, for example, the presumptions in the news media is that male offenders are only as guilty as their victims are innocent. And the thing is this doesn't just affect how the crimes are reported, but whether they're reported at all. In a study of local crime newscasts in Canada and the United States, Dowler established that minority crime victims received a less sympathetic tone of news reporting and less media attention than those of white victims. In the United States, black and Hispanic male and female victims face a higher likelihood than of white victims of receiving no coverage at all. People that are less victimized and more ostracized won't receive much sympathy by the average person, and this news portrayal of non-white, non-wealthy women creates and upholds this lack of interest. It's a vicious cycle. The news portrays these cases as unworthy of sympathy and therefore unnewsworthy, and so they become understood as unworthy of sympathy by the viewer and therefore disregarded by the viewer as unnewsworthy, even if the viewer isn't intentionally making these decisions and judgments. From a selling standpoint, the news has therefore made it unsustainable to report on stories that they can't easily dramatise or relate to because it won't generate that much revenue, because they've already made it so that people won't be interested in these things by underreporting them. Stories, therefore, including upper-class white women, haven't been portrayed in this way, so the news can work with them to sell their stories. Another thing to point out with this discussion around missing white woman syndrome is the fact that the news is believed to be, by some academics, a constructed reality, something that's manufactured by a journalist. Because of this, it is understood that newsmakers engage in highly subjective and selective process of news production based on socially and culturally constructed criteria, instead of simply objectively reporting events and facts. And because of the perceived universalism that has come with colonialism and white privilege, decisions about who or what is newsworthy are usually filtered through a predominantly Western, white, heteronormative, middle-class male lens. And this is because this is the perceived majority target audience, and so it's understandable why a news source would cater to a dominant demographic. We can define newsworthiness as what makes a story worth telling. However, specific criteria for newsworthiness can change depending on the individual reporter or news organisation. But newsworthy events are usually those considered to be dramatic, unusual, or fit with a continuing news theme. Along with this, cultural proximity comes into play, as readers and viewers will react more strongly to events happening near them that they can relate to. This creates a hierarchy that means that not all crimes are seen as equally newsworthy. Sexually motivated crimes or homicides perpetuated by someone who's unknown to the victim will invariably receive substantial and often sensational attention, to the point that previous literature has actually indicated that news stories exaggerate the risks of violent crimes experienced by high-status white women. This then causes high-status white women to relate to the stories and so follow them, and that will then also encourage high-status men to as well. As Roland Martin argues, these media decision-makers tend to be upper-class white people, most of which are men, and these men will then relate to these stories as their wives or daughters or sisters, and so will push the stories to achieve the same effect in other men. After all, it's something that they'd want to see, so why wouldn't everybody else? But that's the thing, this creates quite a universalistic tone, and so the missing upper-class white women are portrayed to represent the dangers faced to all women, despite the fact that not all crimes of the same severity against all types of women and non-women are reported. Because studies suggest that media exaggerate the dangers faced by middle-class to upper-class white women, that is then related universally as represented as all women. So when people make the valid criticism that this is scaremongering, they often also speak on behalf of the dangers towards all women, including the women whose stories aren't being represented. However, it's not all bad. Despite the ethically questionable motives of news reports, the missing white woman syndrome reveals the power of storytelling to bring young female victims of violence into the public imagination and mobilise resources for their protection. It has the power to ignite public outrage and call for change. For example, like I keep referencing in this video, there's been a lot of attention brought to the violence and dangers faced by women in the UK since Sarah Everard's death, with increasing talks about other dangers such as spiking of drinks and uneasiness of nights out, which has prompted the Girls' Night In boycotts. So if the masses of attention to these women is good from a resource and activism standpoint, then what is the problem? What's wrong with missing white woman syndrome? Exactly that, the key word being white women. The discrepancies between the reportings of the white women who have gone missing and the non-white women going missing is the major issue with missing white woman syndrome. In fact, although some black women may receive some coverage, albeit limited, from news outlets when they go missing, this is usually part of another story that's not actually focused on their disappearance. Like Tamika Huston, who went missing in 2004 but received national news coverage only a year after her disappearance, not because of her disappearance, but because of a debate around the fact that missing women of colour don't receive as much coverage as missing white women. And though I've taken that point from a source, I think it would be hypocritical for me to not also acknowledge that that's what I'm doing right here. These deaths are part of this video, not because of the deaths, but because of the relevance to the story. These stories should have been relevant regardless. They shouldn't need to feature in this video. They shouldn't need to feature in this video to prove a point, because the point shouldn't need to be made. Comparing the coverage of missing white women such as Lacey Peterson and Laurie Hacking with the coverage of missing black women like Tamika Huston and Latoya Figueroa, researchers looked into transcripts of television newscasts from major networks and print stories from The Washington Post and USA Today. Of the 738 stories that ran during the first month of each woman's disappearance, only 1.2% were about Tamika or Latoya. The remaining 729 stories were about Lacey and Laurie. Professor Benilla Silva found that black and Latina missing or murdered women seldom appeared on network crime shows. Some have argued that the tone of coverage of black female victims blames them for putting themselves in harm's way. Victim blaming in this context suggests that these victims are not only less innocent, but also less worthy of rescue and less worthy of any of our attention and sympathy. Within the intersectionality of missing white woman syndrome, we can see a type of racial grammar form, a concept that was coined by Professor Eduardo Bonilla Silva. He defines this as white supremacy that is normalized by either implicit or invisible standards. These standards reproduce racial order as just the way things are. In other words, racial grammar reinforces the status quo, and does so in many different ways. And so this reporting of missing black women or women of colour becomes normal, something that people don't even think to critically engage with. The professor argues that missing white people dominate the news because others see them as universal beings. He believes that this is because people are, at least theoretically, able to identify more easily and care about missing white people than they are of missing individuals of colour. Thus, the subtle standard of placing a premium on white lives helps maintain a racial hierarchy with the white lives on top. And again, this is the problem of overrepresentation. The contrast between the amount of missing white women stories that are broadcasted with the amount of missing women of colour suggests that missing white women are more important than missing women of colour, which creates a hierarchy and upholds white supremacy by default, even if that isn't the intention There is a narrative that resurges every so often after a big news coverage of a missing woman, usually a missing white woman. That coverage often brings to light the danger that women face, such as the murder of Sarah Everard, who is referenced countlessly in this video, as that's the case that comes to mind when I think about the current discourse. And I think the fact that I can recall that story so clearly when there were other missing and murdered women this year implies something in itself. Often this discourse is suppressed already, even when it does surround missing white women. And although the coverage is positive in the fact that it aims to raise awareness of just how vulnerable women can be, it still isn't doing enough in terms of representation. Throughout the decades when social movements occur, they usually begin by representing the most privileged of the marginalised groups. For example, in feminism, this began by representing white women, straight women, cis women, before they began to encompass women of colour and non-cis het women. And I think that with this missing white woman syndrome, we're seeing it happen again. It's still part of a movement that's bringing attention to crimes against women, but although it is positive in that respect, it doesn't mean that its lack of inclusivity doesn't deserve criticism. And there's also the problem of the ulterior motives of missing white woman syndrome, where news reporters benefit from the tragedy without making much of a dent in awareness around femicide and crimes against women. All in all, like many things discussed on this channel, this is a nuanced subject. It's not that the attention towards missing white women is 100% bad. It's not. The problem lies with the lack of focus on other victims of similar crimes. The lack of focus on those who don't fit our criteria. And our criteria shouldn't be necessary when it comes to such horrific incidents. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you're safe and well wherever you are in the world. If you did enjoy, please like and leave a comment about what you think. Subscribe if you're new. And with that, I'll see you soon.